Hello, and welcome to the Thematic Intelligence Podcast, a global data thematic intelligence we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. And the ESG series focuses on the environmental, social, and governance issues impacting companies across the globe. I am Martina and Raveni, and today I'm joined by ESG analyst Amalia Maiden to discuss the decarbonization progress of the industrial sector. Amalia, how are you?
Thanks for having me on the show. I'm good, thanks, Marty.
The end of the last year was concluded with a rather anti-climatic COP28 hosted in Dubai. And I think it's safe to say it was most notable for its mixed messages and weak commitments. However, despite the disappointing lack of push for change shown by many global leaders, net zero and corporate environmental sustainability still remain a widely discussed topic in many boardrooms. Why do you think this is the case, Amalia?
Well, to put it simply, the issue of global warming is just not going to go away. We're past the point of being able to deny its impacts, and particularly with the increasing frequent extreme weather events that we're seeing globally, such as the horrific wildfires destroying the Valparaiso province in Chile over the past week, it's hard to ignore what's ongoing in the world. And forward-thinking corporations are now starting to fear how this will impact their businesses and business models in the long term. Alongside this, the rising temperatures and strained natural resource supplies are just adding further gasoline to an already tense geopolitical climate.
Yeah, and with all this overwhelming evidence, then why was COP28 not a success?
So I think we're well and truly past the point of relying on theatricals such as COP events to provide comforting promises as an instant fix for this highly complex problem that we're definitely exacerbating as we leave it longer and longer. And unfortunately, I for one cannot say I hold much hope for the upcoming COP29 event. However, change is still happening, and I think it's unfair to criticise global leadership overall for what's going on. There is a new wave of ESG that's going to be heavily reliant on the use of regulation and governance to encourage corporate accountability for emission reduction.
Yeah, I agree with you that the change is still happening. And related to this, I want to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about this new way of ESG or ESG 2.0, if you like, and how is it going to impact companies, their carbonization considerations?
So there's going to be a combination of financial incentives and tax deterrence that will be the key driving factor in encouraging companies to transition towards more sustainable practices and reduce their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Alongside this, investors are increasingly looking at ESG performance targets when considering the risks of long-term strategic investments. Companies with well thought out ESG strategies that provide robust reporting on their ESG performance will demonstrate great awareness of the long-term threats of their business and their market. And this can help make them more appealing targets for investment, and overall it will be driving the change that we want to see.
Yeah, this driving power of financial performance is definitely key. I agree with you, as well as the targets, whatever they are, short or long term. Now let's turn the focus into the industrial sector. I've read your recent report, Net Zero Strategies in the Power Sector, and it raises some really interesting points on the risks that climate change will bring to the future sustainability of company portfolios. What were the motivators behind companies setting up net zero strategies in the energy sector?
A key motivator for the energy sector's renewable transition is to appeal to climate conscious markets. Many companies are now expected to report on their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and are setting their own decarbonisation targets. And the Scope 2 emissions will include any emissions from purchased energy and electricity. So many companies are now looking to source their energy from lower carbon or renewable providers. As a result, energy companies will now be looking to at least diversify their portfolio to include a wider renewable offering and to appeal to this growing market that we're seeing.
Okay, you said diversifying the portfolio. How they are going about this?
Well, unsurprisingly, power generation through fossil fuel combustion is the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions across the energy sector. And in particular, we're seeing power companies prioritising short-term phasing out of coal-fired power generation and a long-term portfolio transition towards renewable and low carbon energy sources. And these include wind and solar power as the key ones that investors are looking at.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely a good start, but so far you've mentioned scope 1 and 2, but what about scope 3? Indeed, I know that as far as concerned the power sector, the main contributors to these emissions are using fossil fuels to generate electricity, so scope 1, and the use of no renewable gas by end users, which is scope 3, while scope 2 only accounted for 3% of all emissions. So again, what about this scope 3?
Yes, for the power sector specifically, the success of this renewable transition has drastically helped to reduce their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. However, overall, the world still faces a considerable issue when looking to decarbonise fuel. We're seeing leading companies across the energy sector directing investments towards alternative fuel sources, and in particular, green hydrogen.
Green hydrogen?
Okay, so this is the generation of hydrogen fuel sources using renewable electricity as the source of energy for the process. This field of renewables shows great promise as an alternative fuel source for many high-emitting industries, such as the transport sector and, as we've been talking about, the industrials. When it's consumed, hydrogen fuel doesn't emit carbon and therefore will negate the issue of scope 3 emissions from the consumption of energy by end users, as you mentioned. However, there's still great limitations to overcome, such as inconsistent energy supplies from wind and solar sources that limits the production of hydrogen fuel. So companies looking to make investments into this field will have to look for long-term promises rather than short-term solutions.
Oh, thanks for clarifying this. Really interesting, and according to me, this shows great promise as a route to reducing the scope 3 emissions from the consumption of energy by end users. As you mentioned, the industrial sector is a significant global emitter when it comes to the energy consumption. And when looking at the state of decarbonization in the mining industry, it's been really interesting to compare the progress and strategies. So first of all, many leading mining companies has long-term net zero goal, since as you point out before, there is an intense regulatory pressure on emissions. Most of them set 2050 as the target year for achieving net zero carbon emissions, while for the short-term targets typically aim for around 30% reduction by 2030. And said that, Scope 1 and 2, so those emissions generated by business operations, make up around 40% of total emissions, and main contributors include the use of heavy machinery, haul transportation, various on-site processes, the purchase of electricity, so on and so forth. So in terms of how they can reduce these emissions, I'd say that shifting power sources is the main game in town. And I'm talking about increasing the share of renewable energy consumption, mainly through power purchase agreements, and in those cases where grid power isn't available, where mining companies operate directly through on-site power plants. And why, as a final point, say that diesel displacement in favor of mining vehicles powered by electric batteries is more of a medium-term emissions reduction strategy.
And I assume that, as with much of the industrial sector, for these mining companies, their scope 3 emissions represent a large portion of their total greenhouse gas emissions. However, as we're seeing with quite a few of these sectors, scope 3 emissions can present quite a difficult task to reduce, as this scope covers emissions across the whole supply chain. How are the mining companies approaching this in their strategies?
Yeah, as you said, scope 3 emissions represent a large portion of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, they are around 60% of total emission within the mining sector. And scope 3, which are value chain emissions, are tricky ones for mining because they really depends on different factors mining company cannot control at all, such as the ore type. Just think about the difference in terms of material extracted between gold and copper. Or transportation. If we stick to the same example, the emissions to transport gold will be hugely less than copper, but also other factors can be product processing and use. So in general, it's safe to say that the business case for emission reduction varies among mines and companies, and comparing scope 3 emissions among mining companies is not possible due to the diverse nature of mining operations. But yeah, it's a challenge to address given their prominence compared to scope 1 and 2. And to do this, to reduce them, supply chain collaboration is definitely key. Companies indeed need to work with downstream industries to jointly develop and implement emission reduction initiatives. I'm thinking, for example, um, some of them can be the optimization of transport methods or the use of cleaner sources of energy or energy efficient technologies. So many mining companies, heavily reliant on steel making companies, are switching away from blast furnaces or adopting carbon capture. So yeah, of course, here there is still a lot of progress to be made, but seems the general approach of mining companies.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Marty. And it's quite interesting the different approaches that we're seeing across this whole industry.
Thank you, Amalia, for those instant insights. You can find out more about companies' net zero strategies across different sectors on the intelligence centers and in the report store. Thanks for listening, and from us in Thematic Intelligence, see you next time.